is the Bearcast, presented by Bird Culchion Ford. Bird Culchion Ford has been in Waco since 1936. Ford is the #1 selling truck in Texas 43 years running. The Bearcast is also presented by WellMed Medical Management and USMD Health System Dallas. Here's Craig Smoak and Grayson Grundhoefer.
And welcome into a brand new edition of the Bearcast on SicEm365.com. Hope you're having a good one wherever you are, whatever you're up to, and whenever you're getting a chance to listen to this podcast, whether live on YouTube Tuesdays at around noon or via the app listening live or just going back via your favorite app source and listening. We do appreciate you, and thank you for being with us as we are just around the corner from the kickoff of the regular season after a long wait. In which we've been here basically every single week, not just, popping up all of a sudden. Grayson, this has been a grind of an offseason with realignment and recruiting and all sorts of things going on. But, man, we are almost there, and we will cover a bit more, a few notes when it comes to fall camp and kind of what's going on, attrition on the roster, things like that. But Texas State, at least you can kind of sense that it's around the corner, so having fun, getting close to that. But how are we doing this week, man?
I mean, it's a good week. I think anytime you get to go to fall camp, get to see practice, they had a scrimmage this weekend. Obviously, that's fun as well. It's like you said, we're just getting closer and closer to football season finally being here, and I think that's the exciting part, really. So now it's just kind of about, predictions, last-minute thoughts on the team, and just kind of seeing how they kind of come together over these next couple weeks before the season actually begins.
I'm Craig Smoak, joined as always by Grayson Grundhoefer. Also have Garrett Ross and Jack McKenzie behind the scenes, just letting you know the team and the folks that'll be, riding with you each Tuesday at around noon throughout the regular season, but all throughout the offseason as well. And a lot of the things that we'll discuss today, we've at least discussed at some point in time, but there's some updates. For example, like a player finally on campus or a random making mention of certain things over the weekend. So let's just dive fully into that. Be football heavy, and we'll get to your mailbag to close things out at the end of the show. But I guess let's kind of start with Aranda and what he talked about, because I think that covers a lot of bases of just sort of what's going on. They had their first scrimmage, and he seemed upbeat and excited about what he saw. He talked about the team and the fact that he feels like they're in a pretty good place. I mean, just in general, I think it's a mystery of what exactly to expect with this team outside of, I think everybody expects, being comfortably bowl eligible and hopefully being in the mix of some big games and in the mix for the Big 12 title. But, to hear positivity and that kind of belief from the head coach isn't always the case. And, sometimes you kind of tamper expectations or whatever, but he seems to be pretty happy with where they are. Seemed excited about what he saw during the scrimmage and said that it was good that, some players who they've kind of, I guess, leaned on as leaders throughout the offseason have transferred that play over to the field as well. And that included Mike Smith, who he raved about, the Liberty linebacker transfer. He talked about Corey Gordon as well, the young defensive back. He also made mention of Blake Shapen, Keytron Jackson, the running backs just in general, Dominic Richardson and Richard Reese. Those were all some names that he brought up from the scrimmage this past weekend, but also said, those are basically the guys that have kind of been leading the way in general. TJ Franklin, another one of those guys. So I just thought it was interesting to kind of hear him lay out those names and kind of give you some insight onto who sort of the leaders have been and who are emerging. I don't think Franklin's a surprise, but, hearing Mike Smith, hearing Corey Gordon, hearing Keytron Jackson, hearing just hearing some of that, and then hearing, kind of positive updates on Blake Shapen's progress sort of gives you a better idea of who the faces are in a way. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think in general, these are most of the names we've talked about a ton. I agree. Corey Gordon is kind of one that, it's good to hear his name because he's making this transition to star. They really need him to play well. They got him and Bryson Jackson both going to play a lot of time at that position and split reps to some extent. But I think in general, when you look at how the star position's been constructed under Dave Aranda, Corey Gordon fits that mold a whole lot better than Bryson Jackson does. And so kind of seeing him have a good day, that's really nice to see. But the other ones, these are guys we've mentioned since the spring as guys who have been really, really good and have continued to be productive. When you talk about Keytron Jackson, who we've talked about a ton, and a lot of people got turned off by his spring game performance, and we just sat here and told everyone, calm down. It's been every scrimmage this guy has played in, he has been absolutely dominant. And Dave Rand has mentioned his name multiple times, so that's a good one. Dominic Richardson, Richard Reese continue to kind of pull away from the field at the running back position. I'm getting closer and closer to thinking that group is going to be more like 2021 than 2022. And what I mean by that is, when you look at these two guys, I think there's a realistic chance that they're going to look a lot more like Abram Smith, Treston Ebner as far as carry count goes, compared to last year where you had Squirrel, Quaylon Jones, Tay McWilliams at the beginning of the year, Richard Reese. There's just kind of a mix and match. I think it's going to be closer to 2021. And then, of course, Mike Smith, who's gotten a lot of hype ever since he attended Big 12 Media Days, a guy who's clearly emerging as a leader, but also a very productive player. And then, as you mentioned, TJ Franklin, who's probably had the best camp from spring through fall of anyone on the roster. I mean, the guy's been spectacular, and we've heard all these numbers about, 20 sacks in the spring, and he's continued that in the fall. And I think I'm just eager to actually see that on the field because he's never been that during his time at Baylor. He's never been this high sack number guy, but we've heard his name a ton. I heard, potential of possibly competing with James Lynch for the all-time sack record. I mean, there's a lot of things out there right now because of how dominant he's been that make you go, okay, is TJ Franklin really turning this major corner, or is this something we need to be concerned about with the offensive line? I think that's another area that I'm kind of trying to think about as well. But in general, great to hear that for TJ in his last year.
Yeah, no, speaking of James Lynch, sad to hear that he's got a torn ACL and that he will miss the upcoming NFL season, which was expected to be the final year of his rookie contract with the Vikings. So that puts him in a tough spot. But obviously you got to rehab before you start worrying about all the rest of the, career and contracts and things that come with that. But it was a big year because it was the final year of his rookie deal. And now instead of, playing to earn another opportunity with either Minnesota or, a big contract elsewhere or something, he's going to be rehabbing a torn ACL for the next, several months. So shout out to James Lynch. Don't know if he listens to this pod or not, but I'm sure some former player does, and they can pass along our well wishes because I think that news stinks, but
hate to hear
part of the deal. And his sacks record from just a few years ago still stands. And if TJ Franklin goes and flirts with that and beats that, then that would obviously be a major story because he's not someone you think of as Mr. Sacks Master by any means. But good to hear that there's some positive, reviews coming out of his game because he is a longtime leader now that really needs to take that to another level this season. So those are names you've heard, but just to kind of hear Randa reinforce that, Corey Gordon, TJ Franklin, and Mike Smith are basically our leaders on defense. Blake Shapen, Keytron Jackson, and then, a sprinkling of whether it's Dom Richardson or Richard Reese or whatever, kind of leading the way on offense. But particularly on defense, I know there's been a lot of discussion. I think there was an article on, Corey Gordon and just kind of his fit and all of that. But the Mike Smith reviews are kind of getting out of hand. Mm-hmm. When they went and added all of the players that they added, which was double-digit numbers of players in the offseason, they were adding guys at literally every position group. And I think all of them were addressed in some form or fashion. I mean, even the kicking game had a transfer addition.
Except for safety.
Except for safety, I guess, but every other group. And if you want to lump that in with defensive backs, then technically that got checked as well. But I guess safety was the only one that wasn't officially addressed. But I guess depending on what player we're talking about, varying degrees of responses. But Mike Smith coming in from Liberty, I don't remember that getting much of a real hero's welcome or anything like that. It was just kind of like, okay, sure, we need linebacker help. Let's add this guy. I don't think much was really known about him because I don't know how many people really keep up with Liberty football. I won't pretend to be some massive follower, so I had to learn a little bit about Mike Smith. But, man, if you didn't know much about him, which I think is the case for most people, you certainly had to have been impressed. And even if you did, you had to be impressed by the amount of praise that Dave Aranda has had for him really ever since he arrived. He's been a constant. He was a Big 12 Media Days invite, and Aranda had nothing but positive things to say about him once again after the scrimmage. He called it the Mike Smith show on defense. So, man, what is your expectation for Smith, and what do you make of just kind of the impact he's made early on here?
I think it's important to remember that this is a guy that played JUCO football for 3 years. I mean, this guy really grinded to get to the point where he could actually play Division I football, ended up at Liberty, and Liberty fans may not even know him that well because he was only there for a year. I mean, so this is a guy who's been on a journey for sure to get to this point where he's a Power 5 player. And I think the biggest thing about his recruitment with Baylor, and maybe why it wasn't, I don't think people talked about it quite enough, but I think the general consensus is this. Baylor had another linebacker transfer who was supposed to come visit the weekend that he ended up visiting. The moment he entered the portal, they canceled the other linebacker's visit and got him on campus immediately to go on a visit. This was a guy that they made a priority at the linebacker position immediately once he entered. I think that speaks volumes about what they thought about him, about what they gathered from the Liberty coaching staff and everything along those lines about the kind of person he is, the kind of leader that he is. And in general, I think it's a great fit. And ultimately, as time progresses, the more you hear his name and the more you hear about him as a leader, but then also the production on the football side of things. I mean, Dave Aranda mentions him every single time that we talk to him, just about, man, Mike Smith had 16 tackles in this one. He had 11 tackles in this one. It just seems like the guy's making plays all over the place. And it's really interesting because I think going into this year, a lot of people thought, okay, Matt Jones, is time to take this big step. And maybe it still is that time, but I think in general, we've heard a lot more about Mike Smith than any other linebacker. And that's very intriguing because it is a position that I do have some question marks about.
Yeah, I think we might have heard about him more than anybody on defense other than TJ Franklin.
Yeah.
And I guess, Corey Gordon would maybe start to be up there here of late. But again, that goes back to those are the three guys that he mentioned as kind of the faces of the defense or the leaders of the defense in so many ways.
I think the Corey Gordon one is more because he's made a move and that he's kind of new as opposed to dominating every time that he plays. Does that make sense? It's a little different.
Yeah, no, he's coming into his own. They're excited about him, and he's kind of growing, and, there's growing anticipation because of what they're seeing, whereas, Mike Smith's been doing it, like he said, ever since the third day of camp, basically, and he wasn't talking about fall camp. He was talking about spring ball. So, he's come in and been a house on fire. So if you're looking for somebody kind of new to keep track of, or if you're just, hey, what to make note of, Mike Smith is certainly a name to make note of, and that was just reinforced over the weekend after hearing Aranda post-scrimmage. Won't unpack everything because everything kind of leads into other things as well, but he also did talk about the running game and just address the fact that Quaylon Jones is no longer on the team, which has been the case now he's been off the team for a while, but Aranda hasn't talked about it because, we just talked to him very sparingly, and the news really didn't get out there with Quaylon. I mean, that wasn't up until a couple of weeks ago, really, that was reported, I guess.
First day of practice because he wasn't on the roster and he wasn't at practice.
So that was about 2 weeks ago.
Fall camp.
It was 2.5, 3 weeks ago when they kicked off fall camp. So that's still relatively new, and he hadn't talked about it. So he got asked about it, and basically it's Quaylon that, can look in the mirror and say, like, hey, this is why this didn't work out. And, that's unfortunate. That's part of life. You make decisions go certain ways, and then there's results that come from that. And the result of, all this is that Quaylon's no longer on the team, but, he wished him well and said that they tried to work with him through the issues and just weren't unable to do so. And that's, sometimes what happens. So, he certainly, wasn't wishing him ill will or anything like that. But I do, appreciate how positive he seemed to sound about the fact that, he's gone, but we like everybody else in the room as well. He talked about Bryson Washington, who was noticeably absent from practice the past couple of times they've had open sessions. And I say noticeably because you look at the group and it's very small when he's not out there. And when Quaylon Jones was no longer out there, all of a sudden you're down 2 guys, and there's 5 guys, 4 of them are scholarships, and you're going, man, I don't know if that's going to cut it all year long, especially if you look at last year and how quickly that sort of fizzled. When one guy got hurt, it was like, boom, domino effect. So I was wondering about Bryson Washington, And he addressed that and said that he's working through an injury, but that they expect him back by the second scrimmage. So that's just here in a few days, and that was certainly good news. But, mentioned Dawson Pendergrass, mentioned Jordan Jenkins, mentioned Dominic Richardson, Richard Reese, and then you had Washington in the mix, and he said he feels good about that running back room. So how are you feeling about just kind of everything revolving around that group? And do you feel like he does, that they've got a solid, I guess, fivesome that they can rely on, even if it's a bit of a younger leaning group? Certainly bringing Richardson in brings some veteran leadership that otherwise is not really there. That's a lot of young guys filling out that backfield.
Right. And I mean, as I mentioned, I'm getting closer and closer to thinking that this is more 2021 than 2022 as far as how these carries are going to be split up. We say, it's very hard to stay healthy, and it definitely is at the running back position. But 2021, Abram Smith and Treston Ebner basically played every single game. Now, they were older guys, so you maybe anticipate Dominic Richardson could hold up that long. But, Richard Reese is still just a true sophomore, so still a very young guy in his own right. But I think as you get deeper down the running back room, you see some names. And Jordan Jenkins, it's kind of one of those things where it's time for him to at least be able to take over a role if something does happen to one of the top running backs on the roster. I'm not anticipating him to get a ton of carries unless injury does happen, but I do think it's time for him to be ready in a situation like that. I heard Dawson Pendergrass played really, really well during the scrimmage this weekend. Heard some really, really good things about him. I've heard the word underrated with him in the past, which makes a lot of sense. He was from a small high school in Mineola, absolutely dominated that high school, though, and was a phenomenal player in his own right. And now he's just playing more full-time running back, whereas at his high school, the guy was taking direct snaps and just running from basically a wildcat position, then throwing the football at times as well. But he apparently is playing really, really well at this moment. But like you said, Bryson Washington was the guy I was most excited about coming into camp as possibly being the third running back. So they definitely need him to be healthy. He's a very good player, was awesome at Franklin. And now as a true freshman, he's got an opportunity to potentially work his way into that third running back spot, which would be huge for him. So yeah, need to get him healthy for sure.
Yeah, I mean, just good to see him, kind of shine some praise on the younger guys who we haven't seen anything from, or very little from. In the case of Jordan Jenkins, nothing from Pendergrass, obviously, because he's new as far as, official game action. So Bryson Washington also brand new, and good chance we'll see all three of those guys at various points. But yeah, it'll be Reese and Richardson, but it sounds like everybody better be ready to strap them up and be ready to go. And he did make mention that with Quaylen gone, like Bryson Washington's going to have to fill in some of that role. Richard Reese is going to be leaned on heavier to fill in some of that role. And he's not by any means irreplaceable, so that's certainly doable. But it does sound kind of all hands on deck from that running back room. But good to hear about Bryson Washington, and that it's nothing serious, and that he's going to be back before you know it. I guess elsewhere, he touched on realignment. We don't really have to talk about that here because it was just more of him being a West Coast guy, and he's happy for the Big 12, also sad for the Pac-12, and just kind of for football history. And he also made mention of, just as a coach, that you could tell it bothers him, like it probably bothers a lot of other guys, of just sort of the certain way things are working, where, you want to be able to recruit guys, hold on to them, coach them, go through life with them, do all these things. And now it makes it almost impossible because, you can't even bench a guy before he jumps in the portal. It's just, you can't even do one thing here or there before they're like the conferences are shifting dramatically. And so it sounds like he's frustrated, not to a point where it's going to affect anything, but it was interesting to hear him kind of talk about like, yeah, this is all good, especially for the Big 12. But as a Pac fan growing up, it was a little bit bittersweet to see recent events, and always good to get his thoughts on just topics off the field, as much as he's fun to listen to talk about things on the field as well. Had a lot of praise for Blake Shapen. That was another thing coming out of the media session, and just kind of talked about how he's continued to progress and taken the necessary steps. But those were basically the highlights, I think, of his conversation. So scrimmage-wise, what would you like to discuss, or what else maybe did you hear, or something that he had to say stands out from this past weekend?
I mean, the Blake Shapen thing, that's obviously great to hear. He's been very vocal about Blake Shapen all offseason, just the progress that he's made as a leader, also as a football player. He mentioned scrambling, which was rather interesting because after last year, I did not exactly get a ton of confidence in Blake Shapen's ability to run the football. But I do think if he becomes a little bit more I don't know if the word smart is correct, but maybe a little less risk adverse, because he really did take some opportunities that ended up, not being very good for Baylor last year. When you talk about the fumbles, you talk about the big hit against West Virginia, you talk about him lowering his shoulder at times and then sliding short of the sticks other times. It was kind of a mixed bag, I would say. So it's good to see that maybe he's improved in that area, because if he gets a better feel for it, I do think that could be somewhat a productive part of the offense. He also mentioned third downs. They were not great on third down last year, so to hear him converting third downs is very nice to hear as well. So I think you add that all together and you continue to see this transformation of Blake Shapen, a guy who is playing a lot better football than he did last year, and I think a guy who's got his confidence back.
Yeah, I feel like he's going to be a big factor. I mean, to say the least, the starting quarterback will be a big factor, but I think he's kind of like the swinging one way or the other factor for this team in so many ways of, however the wind's blowing with him is kind of going to be the direction they're probably heading. And so to hear all of the praise, all the changes, all the maturity, growth and things like that, I'm fascinated to see him finally out there and see how different it looks. And I know people aren't probably trying to get their hopes up too high, but it's been very positive, and you just hope that it translates on the field, because the last thing you want is to kind of go right away and it looks kind of the same as it did last year, and then you're like, all right, so 12 games of this, huh? I can already see it, that first interception throw, you know what I mean? But if he can get off to a good start and build up some confidence early, I do think that would be huge, and it sounds as though he's doing everything possible. I mean, outside of actually going and doing it on the field in a real-life game, I don't know what else he could do at this point based on everything that we've heard. So that's all that really remains at this stage, and that's just a couple of weeks away, obviously. Elsewhere, he did mention Jackie Marshall out for the year after injuring his knee, right? Torn ACL for Jackie Marshall, who's been out really since spring ball, but that news just kind of finally getting out there. And, as a part of that, he mentioned that was, basically the reason they went and got Justin Sambu from Maine, who now takes some of the role that Jackie Marshall would have had otherwise. So there he talked about Sambu a little bit and just confirmed the Marshall news, but also some news that he wasn't able to confirm just yet, but that has taken place as far as a big transfer note that people were kind of waiting on to drop. And, well, it's dropped now, has it not, with a Johnny Carter?
Somewhat. He hasn't practiced yet, so still waiting on that. Still waiting on that part of it, but he was at the scrimmage on Saturday in a watching capacity is what it seems. That was confirmed through his Instagram, posted on his Insta story, which honestly is the first step, right? Justin Sambu posted a picture of him at Baylor. Then the very next day he was practicing. So I do think this is one of those things where he should be practicing, I would guess, in the next week would be my anticipation there. But it's still big news. Like, he didn't just show up to just show up. Like, he showed up because he's getting ready to play for Baylor, right? Like, that's what you can take away from that. That's huge news. I know everyone's been waiting on this situation to clear up with the Johnny Carter to actually get on campus. But once again, I'll reiterate, the staff was prepared for this. The staff knew this was going to take a while. They knew he had to complete another semester of classes at Utah State, and so it was going to take a while before he actually enrolled at Baylor. So this, again, was not unexpected, and they took him regardless. So they feel really good about what he can bring to the table. The Jackie Marshall thing, though, I do want to talk a little bit about that. So he didn't play in the spring game. And there was, I really feel like there was I don't think anyone knew what exactly had happened before the spring game. But then after the spring game, more reports started coming out, I think, and people started to get an idea of what was going on there. And then you show up at fall camp and he's not on the field. And that's when you start the red flags start showing up and you start going, okay, how hurt is he actually? And so then you actually got the confirmation from Dave Aranda. This was something that we alluded to at the beginning of fall camp, and we alluded to, I believe we talked a little bit about it last week as well. So hard to see. It's really tough to see this because Jackie was set to have a really big year, but it also, like you said, speaks to the reason why they brought in Justin Sambu to come in. And right now, I do want to mention this because it's rather interesting. There was this thought process that it's going to be TJ Franklin and then Justin Sambu at the same position. But the more that this is kind of going on, and after Sambu just arrived, I do think that there's a chance that it's going to be more Gabe Hall with Justin Sambu as his primary backup, TJ Franklin with Trey Wilson as his primary backup. And then, of course, you got the nose tackle position featuring Trevin Maya. But just putting that out there that it does cause a little bit of a shakeup, and it does move people around a little bit to get your best guys in the two deep. But yeah, just something to monitor. Really sad for Jackie. He was poised to have a really, really good year.
Yeah, he was. And, they did a fine job of keeping kind of tight-lipped on that. And, like you said, there were little murmurs, but, no outlet. Whether TV, radio, print, whatever, nobody had any idea until they finally broke that. So, to learn that was really unfortunate. And he was somebody who, had a lot of hype for and brings a bit of energy and excitement, and just will now have to go to the rehab route and hopefully navigate that successfully and as quickly as possible. But unfortunate that he won't be making an impact this year in any capacity other than just cheering on his teammates and doing what he can from the sidelines. Got that note and how it related to Justin Sambu. But Ajani Carter, it's big, big cornerback, right?
Mm-hmm.
Transfer that has just been a story of just sort of patiently waiting, I guess, to get him on campus. And now you're getting down to the nitty-gritty of it. So it would be huge to finally get him into full swing. But it was positive progress to at least see him on campus, as you mentioned, this past weekend. So that's a lot of notes from just this past weekend and just sort of unpacking everything and sort of where we are. What else from the scrimmage or Dave Aranda or just things that maybe you've heard before we move on here would you like to add, if anything?
I think those were the biggest ones that I've heard. I think outside of that, the injuries haven't really taken a huge toll at the moment. Obviously, these are pretty big ones that we've mentioned, but it seems like they're relatively healthy to start fall camp, knock on wood. But outside of that, practices have been really good. Everything seems very focused. They've been using the outside and the indoor quite a bit.
The indoor looks great, by the way.
It does.
100 yards. It looks like a still construction project from the outside because it is, but I'm interested to see how they gussy it up inside because it was kind of plain for the longest time, and they really did need to redo the indoor in some capacity. Like if they weren't going to rebuild it, they needed to just put a fresh coat of paint on it, I felt like, because you'd walk in there and it's like white walls, which is fine, but they had these banners of draft picks, and those were great too. But after a few years, and I've been around long enough now to have seen like the sun bleached out the colors of the hanging murals, there was cobwebs all over the place, because it's just, like nobody's going up there and cleaning that on a regular basis. The white was kind of getting dingy. You know what I mean? It got older. It's like a house, after you need to put a fresh coat of paint on it. So I felt like the indoor was getting to the point of where it was pretty plain. It was kind of aging. And, especially in comparison to a lot of the other facilities you see now, like it was not in anywhere close to the league that it probably should be in. But now it's 100 yards. It already looks a world different just because it's a lot more breathable, just being much bigger. And I'm curious to see how they kind of decorate it up and paint it up and do all of that.
And the lobby will be different entering. That'll look a lot better. They'll have a sky bridge from there to
There's a lot of work still to be
ops.
done. But the sky bridge, like it's hard to even imagine what that's going to look like without seeing it. So that's something that I think is going to be very cool, but it's kind of hard to envision what that'll actually look like. There's that work. There's the full lobby that they'll be doing as well. But that's coming along, and then, it's hard to really see anything other than a skeleton right now of the actual football facility of what will be the football operations center. But when you stand out there where typically the players run out onto the field, which has kind of changed over the years, it's dependent on construction, it's dependent on who the coach was, but typically where they run up and have, since I got here, since Browse was the coach, that little hill, It's a lot different, man. And when you run out of that field, you see the football ops center in front of you and this long indoor now to the right of you, and it looks like a little bit of a different world. It's going to feel like a real football facility when it's all said and done in kind of its own little area, which I know has been the long overdue goal. But just kind of cool to see those projects coming along and see how different they're going to make everything feel.
Yeah, it absolutely needed it, and it's going to be great. I mean, if it's anything comparable to the Welcome Center, then it's going to be beautiful because that turned out extremely well when I got to go see that. So, yeah, they needed this. I mean, to catch up and keep up with everyone in the Big 12, you got to make these changes and, pour in the necessary means to make this happen, and that's exactly what Baylor did. I mean, if you want to be a big-time football school in the new Big 12, you got to have the facilities for it, and I think Baylor's definitely going to have those in the near future.
Yeah, it's cool to see. If you're out there in the near future, you'll definitely see a difference, but you'll also be able to tell that there's a long way to go. I know the indoor still has, another – when is that going to be finally done? Not for football season, obviously,
No.
but I don't even remember the timeline on that, but it's still got a ways to go.
I think it's summer.
Next summer, yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they'll practice in there, but it's not anywhere close to being done. But it's noticeable if you're over on campus, all the work that's being done. I mean, it's hard not to miss. And when it's all finished, it's going to feel like a brand new world versus what kind of has been in place for a long time now. So excited to see that continue on. Meanwhile, one thing that's going to drum up again as the season begins and games begin is recruiting. And on the recruiting front, obviously, these last few months have been very busy just in terms of the Justin Sambus and the Johnny Carters and those guys. But they have also in that time gotten to work on next year's class. We've talked a bit about that. It seems like there's little stretches where every week there's a new commit we were talking about. But just to kind of bring everybody up to snuff on where we are now. It's been a dead period. Had the season starting here in a couple of weeks. Let's reset the table on where the Bears sit and kind of what to expect here moving forward.
Right. So in the month of June, they had 3 official visits. Of those 20 prospects, 12 are committed to Baylor, 5 are committed elsewhere, and 3 of those remain uncommitted at this current moment. That gets you to that 20 number. And so basically the reason why I say that is because this Baylor staff has essentially really focused on those official visits and those prospects who attended the official visits outside of a couple newer ones here and there, which happened last week, and we mentioned them, Connor Hawkins and Kyler Beatty. Neither of them took official visits. They will probably at the end of the year. But outside of that, there's 3 remaining guys who are uncommitted, and it's NFL Academy offensive lineman Daniel Akinkunmi out of the NFL Academy in London. Then you have Orem High School tight end Roger Saliapaga out of the Utah area, and then Fort Bend Marshall safety Josh Lair. All 3 of those guys are big-time prospects. All 3 of them are 4-star guys in my eyes, and guys who are going to be fights to the finish. Daniel Akinkunmi is basically the sole target on the offensive line for Baylor at the moment. He's going to take his official visit to Oklahoma the first weekend of September. And then it seems like it's a head-to-head battle between Oklahoma and Baylor. Right now, Baylor's in the lead. Baylor's in a good spot, but you never know what happens with that official visit. He also got an offer recently from Miami. I know Clemson's looking at him and Penn State as well. So something to keep an eye on there, but definitely a priority target for Baylor. Then you look at Roger Saliapaga out of Utah. Baylor missed on Dylan Hipp, who chose Ole Miss over Baylor. So now the focus is all on Saliapaga at this very moment. Baylor made his top 10. That top 10 includes Utah, Oregon, Tennessee, Alabama, Washington, Auburn, UCLA. He also got an offer from A&M in Colorado in the recent week. So a very good prospect and one of those guys who, when you turn on his film, it just pops. I mean, this guy as a junior had over 1,200 yards receiving and 14 touchdowns as a tight end. He almost looks like just a big wide receiver, to be honest, at 6'5", 210 pounds. He, again, absolute priority, has a great relationship with Eric Mateos, Jeff Grimes, and A.J. Stewart because his brother actually played at BYU when those 3 were there. So keep an eye on him. He would be an absolutely massive get. Then the other one is Josh Lair. He took official visits to LSU, Texas, Washington. He's also got interest in A&M. I believe that's his top 5 at this current moment. He's a 4-star guy, has over 28 offers. He's been the top safety prospect on the board for Baylor for a long time. and is a guy they've been recruiting really hard. So we'll see with him. He's probably the biggest long shot of the group, but they're still in it. So yeah, that's kind of where they're at right now. Those 3 guys are official visit guys who have not made a decision one way or another. And then I bet they'll have another official visit probably at the end of the year, maybe a couple. I haven't heard anything about having one during the season quite yet. And usually Baylor stays away from that because they want the focus to be all on the recruits instead of having to deal with a game weekend and maybe not giving your recruits as much attention as you would like.
All right, so something to keep track, or some things to keep track of recruiting-wise, and that will ramp up, obviously, as the season starts to get underway. We'll start to be talking about official visits and guys coming in for games and all that kind of jazz. So just another thing that's going to start to spice back up here as we move along in the calendar. But, man, you can kind of feel it all rumbling up and getting ready to just explode and, be the busy several months that we all kind of circle the calendar for, whether it's on the field, off the field, recruiting, what have you. All of it's starting to kind of get in a row. And it's going to be a lot of fun here moving forward. Some of the things, kind of the little nuggets dropped along the way. Top 25 poll came out as well. And just kind of use this to transition, I guess, from the mailbag, unless you have anything else you want to get into. But the top 25 poll, Georgia on top, no surprise there. Michigan, Ohio State, Alabama, LSU, rounding out that AP top 25. No surprise there either. But just want to make mention of the Big 12 teams. You got Texas at number 11, the top-ranked Big 12 squad. You've got Kansas State at number 16, TCU at 17, Oklahoma at 20, and that is your Big 12 ranked teams heading into the season. Texas, K-State, TCU, and Oklahoma. Texas Tech was the highest vote getter, not ranked in the top 25, so they were right there knocking on the door as a full offseason of hype starts to come to a head for them. And that'll certainly be, every team's an interesting story because they've had their offseason storylines, but certainly Tech's received a lot of hype, a lot of dark horse to the point where you're not even a dark horse anymore kind of talk. And so there you have them right on the edge of the top 25. And that will be certainly something to watch. Kansas also receiving votes, although not nearly enough to get into the poll itself. Baylor got 3 votes for the top 25, not nearly enough. They need about 140 more to even get into the top 25, but 3 votes there for them. And that was about it as far as votes go. Wasn't expecting them to be in the preseason top 25, and think it'll take them, certainly beating Utah in week 2 and kind of getting a little bit of a run to probably garner the respect. And speaking of Utah, I mean, even if they were to beat them, and let's cross that bridge when we get there, but there might be a caveat because we don't know the status of Cam Rising and how healthy he will even be at that point. But they need to take care of Texas State first before getting too far ahead of themselves. But that game will be interesting. And, just kind of where you'd about expect them to be, right there in the middle of the Big 12 pack. Not a lot of expectations, also a little bit of respect, and we'll just see on the other end what it actually turns out to be.
Yeah, I mean, this is basically all you could have expected. I mean, if you look at the Big 12 preseason media poll, these were the teams ranked ahead of Baylor in those media polls. And so it makes complete sense that they are where they are. Texas Tech, once again, getting some hype with being, team number 26 as far as votes go. But yeah, I mean, this is a good spot for Baylor. If Baylor goes out, beats Texas State and Utah, they're probably a top 20 team, maybe even top 15 if you're able to beat Utah. So again, they got to go out and handle their business. And if they do that, they'll be ranked very quickly. And once again, these preseason polls, they really don't matter all that much unless you're trying to find your way up the poll towards the end of the year. That's where they really start to matter. But right now, I mean, it's not a big deal. It's about what we expected, I would say, going into the season. You got Texas, K-State, TCU, Oklahoma, kind of the 4 that I do feel like have separated themselves a little bit, with Texas Tech and Baylor kind of right there being that top 6 that's pretty clearly formed in my eyes.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say, and there will be surprises one way or the other. Like, is Oklahoma really that good, or are they more trending downward like some people think? Is Texas really that good, or are they overblown again? I think they're for real this time around just because I think the talent level is pretty undeniable. Like, when you look at it player for player, position for position, I don't know how they're not your favorites other than you just trust TCU's coach or K-State's coaching or talent or whatever.
Or you don't trust Texas.
Or you don't trust Texas, but like it's kind of like whether you do or don't, like that team on their roster, you're like, man, if you don't like go and flirt with winning the Big 12, to me, that has to be a massive disappointment. Like there had to be multiple injuries because this isn't one of those like, oh, they Texased again. Like, no, like really they should be in the mix. And if they're not, then something weird happened there that will be very interesting to talk about. K-State obviously has huge expectations now. TCU, not really expected to miss much of a beat, despite losing tons and tons of talent because of the transfer portal additions and just the belief in Sonny Dykes and what he's doing. Also change at OC now. So a lot of fascinating storylines that we're going to see finally come to a head after months of discussion, and I cannot wait to see what all that looks like on the other side.
Yeah, and I'll say this, Craig. If you're kind of a Baylor fan looking at the preseason poll and you want to come away with one takeaway, it's that the Big 12 is completely open.
Oh, yeah,
I mean, they don't have a single top 10 team. That should tell you quite a bit about how open this league is and kind of the expectations, I think, from the media and pretty much anyone who covers the Big 12 is that the winner of the Big 12, it seems more and more likely, is probably going to have 2 losses by the end of the year is what it seems like to me is kind of the vibe that I'm getting. We'll see if that comes to fruition. It seems like more times than not, someone goes into the Big 12 championship 11-1 or something along those lines. But I do think it's a very wide open league, which gives Baylor a chance.
Yes, it does. So, man, it's going to be a lot of fun, like I said, and I just can't wait for it to get here. But in the meantime, we do have a couple more shows to go, and we do have a couple more mailbags to go as a result of that as well. And let's get into the mailbag to close things out this week. Scotty B., the Baylor King, speaking of Utah, you think Utah is ranked too high, which right now they were at what? Number 14 in the country. And again, there's a lot of questions about Cam Rising. It's debatable because of the quarterback situation. Scotty continues. It's not just because of Cam Rising's status either. Utah quarterback Brandon Rose hurt in a scrimmage recently. Might have been the starter if Rising can't play week 1. They technically only have 4 healthy quarterbacks, including a walk-on. 3 of those 4 are either freshmen or redshirt freshmen, while the other one is a junior. So all of that to say, they've got questions at quarterback. And again, Baylor doesn't play them until week 2, so they got to beat Texas State first. But your thoughts on Utah? Do you think they're ranked too high, and in particular because of the questions around Cam Rising?
Yeah, and Utah's got to beat Florida as well, which is another kind of part of this equation. But, I think it's pretty foolish to say they're ranked too high. I mean, this is a program that's been extremely consistent under Kyle Whittingham, and I trust their defense to be phenomenal once again. I mean, this is a group that just goes out and they win football games, period. I mean, they've gone into New Year's Six Bowls and looked really, really good, and they've competed against everyone in that conference at an extremely high level. So they deserve to be a top 15 team, no doubt about it. I think if there were no questions about Cam Rising at all, they'd probably deserve to be borderline top 10 in my eyes. But so I do think that is put into this equation a little bit. But in general, no, they're not ranked too high. They're right where they should be. And I think they're going to be really good once again. But yes, in general, as far as the ceiling goes, you are correct. If he's not healthy, yeah, that might cause problems. But I don't think you can go into the season just assuming someone, will not be healthy for an entire year. I think that would be kind of a fool's errand.
Yeah, and as you said, I mean, I'm thinking about it just from the Baylor perspective, but they do play Florida, so they might not even be ranked by the time they play Baylor in only week 2. Just depends on what happens there in week 1, and no idea really on where his status is, although it's very much up in the air. Just on the surface, it seems right now. Big Cheese 83, it seems like everything we've heard about TJ Franklin since spring's been astonishingly positive. Is it unreasonable to believe he could have a double-digit sack season this year? And we kind of talked about that earlier.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would say it's unreasonable, but I definitely think it's a long shot. Even though he's had this amazing spring and this amazing fall, getting double-digit sacks is really, really difficult. Like, I forgot the stat that I looked up. I'll look it up here in a minute. But there were only I think 7 or 8 guys last year who had 10 sacks. And, the guy who went number 2 overall or number 3 overall in the NFL draft, Will Anderson, only ended up with exactly 10 sacks. And he's a phenomenal player. And so I think, saying 8 I think 8 is kind of my like high end expectation for TJ, but it's not impossible to think that, hey, he had this huge turnaround and maybe, ends up with double digit sacks. I guess it's possible.
It's possible. I wouldn't bet my paycheck on it, though, or even other reasonable amounts of money, because it's almost one a game, and he's not exactly like Mr. Sackmaster back there. So, yeah, I think it's possible if he were to get double-digit sacks. I think that would be pretty incredible, and certainly would be an exceptional year for him. But, yeah, not banking on it. His career, 1, 1.5, 4, and 1.5. So to get double digits would mean a skyrocketing of his stats and, getting 6 more than the 4 he got in his career high year 2 years ago. So that's a lot of extra sacks than we're used to.
For sure. And that 4 sack year, if he would have been playing full time, there's a chance that maybe he would have gotten to, 6 or maybe like the 8 that I'm talking about. But there were only 14 guys last year who had double-digit sacks. That tells you how hard it is to actually get 10 sacks. To be a top 14 guy in sacks, that's a lot to expect from, like you said, a guy who doesn't have that many sacks in his career.
He's got 8 in his career.
Yeah.
So if he were to get double digits, beat his entire career in 1 year. But I understand your point, and, let's see. I mean, there's certainly the hype and the belief in the progress he's made this year that they think he's, ready to take a step. So maybe he does, and maybe that's where we see it the most. Thank you for the question. B. Lantham or Blantham 4. Have reports about the men's basketball trip changed your outlook on the upcoming season? We didn't talk about this, but men's and women's been on their foreign trips, playing exhibitions and whatnot. And has any of that changed your outlook on the men's basketball team here, for 23-24?
It hasn't changed anything for me. It's more so just solidified what I thought this team was going to be. I think they're going to be a top 2 team in the Big 12. Them and Kansas, I think, are both going to be borderline top 5 teams, top 10 for sure. And they're both going to be really, really good. And Baylor's going to have a great opportunity to potentially be a 1 seed, potentially win the Big 12. And I just think this trip just shows you kind of, when I saw these transfers come in and really looked at their game and how it all meshed together, and then you add in Jacoby Walter, who I viewed as a really, really good player, like, top 10 type guy, maybe even top 5 in his class, that's come to fruition as well. You bring back Jalen Bridges. I just think this is a veteran team with a bunch of parts that really make sense. And so, yeah, I think it's more so solidified than changed things.
Do you think the O-line will be better in 24 than this year's line?
So next year being better than this year. I think they're going to be about the same. I mean, you're replacing Clark Barrington next year, and I think he's got a chance to be an all Big 12 type guy. I really think he's going to be phenomenal for them at center. And, maybe you're able to find a transfer. But if I look at the roster right now, I'm not taking into account adding a high-end transfer, which if that happened, that could change things, right? But right now, if I just look at it and look at the turnover going into next year, I think this offensive line will be as good as 2024, and I would probably bet on them being a little bit better. But I think it's going to be close, and Eric Mateos, of course, gives them a chance to have a top 3 offensive line in the Big 12 every single year.
Yeah, I think it's hard to say right now. There's just a lot of moving parts, but I do think that the angle that you're taking is probably about the right angle for right now. It's like, they'll lose some talent again, but as long as you have Mateos, you feel pretty good about things. And again, like, who even knows at this point where he is? I mean, I know you want to just assume, but it's coaching college football, and there's a lot of moving parts. So yeah, I mean, on paper, in the same vicinity, but let's get there first, because that is a long ways away. And I'm curious about the 23 line. Are they going to be better than last year's line, even though they lost a lot of talent off of that line? We'll find out soon enough. Do you think Sawyer Robertson would wait his turn if Blake Shapen played out his eligibility as the starter? Thanks. Well, thank you for the questions. Which means that Blake starts this year and next year, and then Sawyer's finally
gets 1 year.
The starter with 1 year to go, yeah.
I think that he's very loyal to Baylor, and I do think that he came here with the intention of this being his last stop.
And he's also transferred once already.
He transferred once, so, but he'll graduate. He'll graduate next year, so he could transfer again if he wanted to. I really think that if he loses the job to Blake Shapen next year, it's going to be really hard in my eyes. It's hard for me to think that he would stay if he graduates before next season. that he would stay, but I mean that's a total guessing game. I know right now he's completely bought into the Baylor program. He's been a great leader in that room and a guy who brings just so much positive energy to the group as well. But right now, I think the way that I'm trending is that he would probably look to start somewhere else for 2 years as opposed to Baylor for just one.
Yeah, and the way I'm looking at it is, I understand the question and the thinking about the future, but let's see Blake Shapen actually be that guy first before worrying too much about what Sawyer Robertson might do in a year from now, because Blake Shapen hasn't even, secured the job for this entire year, much less for next year already. But I do understand, that's the point of this podcast. Things just kind of air questions out and think about things, but I just feel like there's a long way to go before really diving into that as a topic, because he might be the starter by week 3 for all we know.
He definitely could be. Yeah. And because we're literally just playing this question as if Blake played
this entire year
and next year,
and did it to the point of he's the starter again, and then played all of another year. And so there's a lot that we're just saying we're kind of fast forwarding through, but in theory, that would be a very interesting situation. So thank you, B. Lantham, for the questions. Just a Bear and Frog World, what effect, if any, do you think adding more teams to the conference will have on gameplay? More teams to scout year to year? How do you guys I guess let's just answer that one first.
It definitely changes things. I think it helps some teams, to be honest, because we've seen over the years this schedule where you're having to play everyone in the league every single year, and you get to kind of learn these tendencies and get to hone in on them every single year that you play them. I think that really helps, honestly. And so having to shift it a little bit and have to figure out different play styles, different strategies, I think there is going to be an impact to that. I don't, specifically Baylor, it could be positive, it could be negative. It really comes down to how the game plan works on that very given week.
Let's see here. How do you guys feel about it as media members, and do you foresee the Pac-12 schools adopting an us versus them mentality? No, I don't see that. What's the point? Brag about the conference you just left that died. That's now a glorified American Athletic Conference, depending on what it looks like on the other end. So I think there'll be some semblance of a rivalry, just because they were kind of unwillingly being added, from a fan's point of view, of they would rather have stayed in the Pac-12 if it were up to the fan bases, or most, if not all of them. So I think there might be that initially, but I don't think they're proud Pac members of they're bringing that flag over and planting the flag for Pac football. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think they're just going to be, hey, we're from a different part of the country. We've been doing different things, and so our way is better. But I think eventually it's going to be Big 12 football. I don't think there's going to be, any massive differences or lines in the sand.
Let's be real about it. I think there's only 2 teams that you can honestly say that about. I think Colorado and Arizona wanted to move here.
Yeah, Colorado's a Big 12 team anyway.
Yeah,
so.
And I think Arizona wanted to be here as well. Arizona State is the only one that's been extremely vocal about, their displeasure for some of the teams in the Big 12. I think Utah was just very loyal. Again, I do think once they're in the Big 12 that they might change their tune. But I do know both those fan bases talked about how the Pac-12 is so much tougher. And I've heard so many schools in the Pac-12 talk about, we're too good for the Big 12. Well, now they're in the Big 12, and I'm expecting them to shift that philosophy and end up being, teams that are very loyal to the Big 12. And I'm hoping that when Utah comes to Waco to play Baylor, that there's a big ceremony type thing, just like there was when Baylor played against BYU in 2021. I'm hoping it's similar to that. We'll see. I think that's going to be a pretty cool environment, though. And I know the one against BYU was a great environment, so hoping it's near that.
Yeah, I think there might be some, tribalism, but that's going to dissipate pretty quickly once they're all in the conference. Yeah. It's just going to be, the new Big 12. Doc Crowell, once they leave, do you think UT will ever schedule Baylor in football again? Yeah, I do. I don't have any time frame on that. I think they'll play everybody, though. I think they'll play TCU. I think they'll play Tech. I think they'll play everybody at some point in time. I just don't know what the order of importance will be. And I do think, Tech, had they actually pulled off the whole scheduling arrangement like they prematurely announced, and then, obviously that fizzled out entirely, that would have been a huge coup for them. But I think part of the reason why it didn't go the way they thought was because I do think Texas intends on probably playing just about everybody at some point in time. I think it would be dumb to not have a home and away with TCU if you could have it as a part of your non-conference with your SEC schedule. Same with Baylor, same with Tech, same with Houston, whoever else you want to throw into that mix. So, yeah, I absolutely believe they will. I just think they'll probably be few and far between as far as meetings go, and I don't have any sort of a timeline on when that first meeting would even be. And it might take a little while. They might, want to wait and just kind of let it breathe a little bit, but eventually they will play again for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll see if Baylor will ever schedule UT in football again. I mean, this is a two-sided thing here, so we'll see how that ends up. I think in general we'll see them play again. But like you said, I mean, it could be a while. I mean, because if they are playing other teams in the Big 12 or if it takes more time because of future schedules, it does make things more difficult. And I know for Baylor, at least, they're going to have they got series against Auburn and Oregon coming up at the end of the 2020s. So they're probably not going to play UT again until the 2030s unless they play them in a bowl.
Which is a bigger, more important game to win, TCU or UT? I think it depends on the situations. I mean, what if TCU is like a 5-loss team, or I don't even know when they play each other in the year, but you know what I mean? And like Texas has already lost a couple games, or is Texas 5-0 and they're number 10 in the country, or is TCU like number 7 in the country and they're whatever their record is at that point in time? I think that matters there. But if you're just asking me straight up, I'd normally say Texas. I think at this point you got to beat TCU though. Like that's the team that's in your conference. You've beaten Texas, and it's not really made that much of a difference in the long run. You're never going to topple them, but TCU's like, they're not going away. They're your rival. They've had your number. There's a lot of crossover there. So to me, I actually think, this year is an exception because it's unique. It's the last time you'll play Texas. So I think that the answer will always be, for a lot of people, Texas on their way out's a bigger deal. But, man, at some point in time, you got to beat TCU. Like, this is getting to the point of it's pretty ridiculous. Not that they've had the losing streak that they've had or the amount of losses. It's the way they've found to do it seemingly in every way imaginable. Getting blown out, losing the closest possible game, losing tight games, losing blowout. I mean, it's been kind of ridiculously one-sided. So where do you sit on this?
The answer is absolutely TCU for me. I know the Texas game could mean a lot at the end of the year. I understand that. Last time you play Texas, that's cool and all, but Baylor's got to beat TCU. They haven't been able to do that very consistently. TCU is going to be in the conference going forward. They're the biggest rival in my eyes for this Baylor program. And the other part about this is Baylor plays them in November at TCU, and Baylor was absolutely dreadful in the month of November last year. They need to change that. They need to get better at closing the season, and I think that game is going to be very important regardless of TCU's record. They absolutely have to find a way to beat TCU this year, and it's on the road too. I just think it means a lot more going forward.
Finally, from Doc, we kind of touched on this earlier. How does Jackie Marshall's injury affect our D-line?
I mean, it's a big loss, but they brought in Justin Sambu from Maine. He'll come in and hopefully help relieve that a little bit. They still got good depth at the front. They still got a good 2 deep in my eyes. I think the injury more so impacts kind of the ability to have a true 3 deep. I think they're more so a 2 deep now with a couple other guys who are really good, but not a true 3 deep. And Jackie had the opportunity to be a true difference maker for this defense, a guy that I was really, really excited about. I loved his film out of high school. I love what I saw last year in moments and flashes, and I really thought this year could be a breakout year for him. So it's a bummer. I think it hurts their upside a little bit, but in general, they did a nice job replenishing the defensive line.
Bear Sack, where's the TTU love coming from? Almost the top 25 ranking when Baylor only gets 3 votes. Am I missing something, or is this just the Joey hype machine working? Well, let's not compare it to Baylor, because one doesn't really have to do with the other, and I don't see why Baylor should have gotten any more than 3 votes, to be perfectly honest with you. I see far more reason to vote Tech in the top 25 on paper than I do for Baylor. But as far as the hype goes, it has been pretty overwhelming. Anywhere you look, they're the sleeper candidate and they're the big hype team to watch in the Big 12 this year. I definitely think some of it's the Joey hype machine. I think he's very, just in general, they're very good about promoting their brand. But I also think, you won 8 games last year. You won your bowl game. You beat Oklahoma. You beat Texas. You've got sold-out season tickets. There's just a lot of positive. You're recruiting really well. You've got your healthy quarterback back that you hope can finally stay healthy for once. and a lot of other weapons from last year's team. So, they got to get better on the O-line and, shore up a couple of things, but they've got weapons. They've got their QB. They've got, all of their ducks in a row, and it seems. So I do think that perhaps the hype's gotten a little out of control, but I also think that comes with the territory. And, that's one of those two. I'm fascinated. Like, do they live up to all this offseason hype? Because there has been a lot of it.
I mean, I mentioned this, what was it, Craig, like 3 months ago, and I remember we were talking about it, and you were like, what hype? And now we've moved forward, and it's like, geez, it's just continued to build.
Yeah, they're not a sleeper, by the way. If you see that written, if that magazine or whatever was written like 3 months ago, then okay. If it's been written anywhere in the last 2 months, then they're not paying attention.
And when you're picked fourth in the Big 12 ahead of a team that was just the runner-up in the national championship, I mean, it's reached full hype mode. So everyone's really excited about Tech. I don't personally get it. I do think that they'll be a bowl team this year. That's not saying much. I think that they're probably going to be closer to a 7-5 or an 8-4 team as opposed to a 10-2 team that's actually going to win the Big 12. That's just my feelings on it. I don't think they're physical enough defensively, nor are they physical enough on the offensive line. That's my issue with them. I think Baylor will be better than them, just like they were a year ago when they went into Lubbock and beat them really, really badly. And Tech has to come here this year. So, yeah, I mean, I understand why you're asking this because it is kind of random to some people and out of nowhere. But if you've paid attention all summer and all spring, this is a team that's getting a lot of love from the media and from writers in the Big 12 that they could have this big breakout year. I'm not a believer in it. That's all.
I see why. I mean, I think I mentioned a lot of the reasons why. I mean, certainly there's an affinity for Joey in the media around here that automatically plays into a little bit. I think people want to see him succeed. I think people believe in him, and rightfully so. And I laid out starting quarterbacks back and finally healthy, and you got a lot of playmakers on offense. So I see it. I see the reasons why. I do think that it's gotten a little bit far ahead of itself. Like, we've almost fast forwarded a little bit. That's my only issue with it, though. But I do think that they should be pretty good, and I'm fascinated to see, with all these other storylines, I mean, but them in particular, because of the way it's been talked up, I'm really interested to see what that team looks like. But they're not hiding from the hype or anything. So, that tells you that it's not just bluster, that there's belief that we really think we're that good, and so we'll see. But that just adds more spice to what is already a pretty spicy Big 12. And we will close it out with this. Bearcats, who are our top 3 defenders at rushing the passer? Can anybody get to 10 sacks this season?
So once again, 10 sacks. Only 14 players in the country got 10 sacks last year. So it's just hard to put that expectation on anyone. So I'm not going to predict that going into the season. Now, top 3 defenders at rushing the passer. It is TJ Franklin, Garmin Randolph, Byron Vaughns. Those are my top 3 pass rushers. Byron Vaughns, of course, the transfer from Utah State. Garmin Randolph and TJ Franklin, veteran guys who I do feel like have an opportunity to have career years. So those are the 3 I'm going to go with.
Sounds good to me. And there's only been 4 double-digit sack guys in Baylor's entire history. It was James Lynch, Sean Oakman, Matthew Pearson in 1992, and John Garrett in 2003. That is your entire list of Baylor Bears getting double-digit sacks. So it's happened a couple times in the last 10 years. It's only happened 4 times in history. So, that's not likely, but, there are candidates that potentially could get there. It's just not all that likely in the long run. So, but no, I mean, those sound like good candidates. I mean, those are the usual suspects as far as who you'd expect to be getting to the quarterback and causing some havoc. So that lines up, and I do appreciate the question to close us on out here. A lot of talk this week about, getting in the backfield and sacks and all that. And I think just a lot of anticipation, kind of feeling out other opponents now as well, and kind of looking around the Big 12 at what some of the storylines are. So a lot of fun that we're getting close. But Grayson, anything before we go here?
No, just be sure to check out Sikkim 365 Premium. We got all kinds of content, news, and notes as fall camp continues to roll on, and basketball and recruiting, everything like that. Be sure to check out the premium side of things. And, of course, 365 Sports Radio, Monday through Friday, 3 to 6.
We will be back next Tuesday at around noon, so you can check us live on YouTube or catch us after the fact via your favorite podcast feed or listen live on the Sikkim 365 app, which you can go download in the Apple Store right now if you haven't done that already. Definitely want to get that downloaded in time for football season. But thanks to Jack McKenzie and Garrett Ross behind the scenes as well, and thanks to those of you watching, listening, giving feedback, asking questions. We do appreciate you, and we will talk to you next time. This has been the Bearcast on Sikkim365.com.